Hi there, thank you so much for clicking on this video. We're going to continue on with ELA mini lesson number 14, and we're going to do a little bit of compare and contrast, but what we're going to do is we're going to kind of focus on two different texts and talk about how each of the texts describes weather and climate in their story, and then we're going to kind of connect that to the author and see kind of what the author was intending the writing for the two different texts to talk about. So a little bit on compare and contrast. How are they similar and different? For sure, but we're going to be focusing on what is being described in each of the stories with weather and climate. So we're looking at two different types of texts and looking at how they talk about weather and climate in both of the texts. There's one that's called a Porky Tale. It is on page 20. It's How Indian Summer Began. And then we're going to compare and contrast it to another text that we read a week and a half ago, Earth's Weather and Climate. It's on page 6, which is more an informational text. So we're going to look and see how these texts describe the effects of weather and climate. And we're going to look at how similar they are and how different they are. So we're kind of doing this Venn diagram in more sentence structure today. So you need your magazine and you need your homeschool packet because we're going to get started. Here we go. So you need to turn to this page in your homeschool packet and we're going to read the directions. The directions say, reread paragraphs 1 through 4 of How Indian Summer Began and paragraphs 1 through 4 of Earth's Weather and Climate. Compare the way each text explains what affects weather and climate. What does this tell you about each author? Okay, so we are going to look at How Indian Summer Began. We're going to look at that text first. And our question that we're going to be focusing on is what affects the climate and weather. So I would like you to turn to page 20, and I'm going to read How Indian Summer Began out loud to you. As I'm reading, I want you to think about what affects the weather and climate. So the question that we're going to be asking ourselves when we're going back and rereading these two different texts is we're going to look at what affects the climate and weather. And when we talk about the word affects, what we're talking about is the word impacts. So we're going to be looking at what impacts the weather and climate in both of the two different texts. So that's going to be our focus. What impacts or changes the weather and climate in each of the texts? How Indian Summer Began. It's a Porky Tale. There is no author for this story. Long ago, there was a generous and grateful man named Notkikad. He was a good farmer. One year, though there was a late frost and his garden died. He planted it again, and there came a drought. Again, he planted, but the cold autumn came and killed the plants. Okay, so right now, the weather is affecting what? The weather is affecting how this person can grow food, the garden that he's created. So weather is, I'm going to take my pen and I'm going to jot this down. I'm going to write down that the weather is impacting his crops. It's kind of making it so he can't grow the things that he's supposed to grow. I'm on paragraph 2. Notkikad was very troubled. His family had gathered berries from the forest, but without the dried corn, squash, and beans, they were not survive the cold winter. The leaves were falling from the trees and the freezing wind blows. So again, the weather is hurting them. It's hurting their crops and it's hurting their food, and they can't get food. So weather is hurting the crops and his family. Okay, so I'm just kind of writing down ideas right here. Remember, what affects the weather and climate? Paragraph 3. One night he spoke to the master of life. I have always been thankful and never asked for help, but I fear for my family. What can I do? Then he went to bed and dreamed. In his dream, the master came to him. I am giving you these special seeds, the master said. I am also giving you time to watch in which to plant them. Okay, so now this character is asking the master of life for help. Okay? I'm just jotting down things that are happening. When Notkikad woke, he found the seeds. He went outside and though the leaves were still falling, the weather was now as warm as summer. He and his family planted the seeds. The next morning, the seeds had already germinated. Green shoots rose out of the soil, the sun rose and set again, and now the young plants were already waist high. So it went from day to day as the special seeds given to him grew rapidly in only a handful of days in the Indian summer. Okay, so then after the Master of Life came, the weather changed and things started to grow in his garden. So the weather changed and things grew. So we're going to go back to our graphic organizer, and for how Indian summer began, what affects the climate and weather. This Master of Life kind of affected the climate and weather, right? He's the one who changed the weather because the crops weren't working. So I would write down the weather was killing the crops for this character, Notkikad, and the Master of Life came and changed the weather for them. So go ahead and write down that in your graphic organizer. Go. All right, now I would like you to turn to page 6. We're going to look at Earth's weather and climate. What affects the climate and weather? So we're on this informational text right now. I'm going to grab a pen or pencil again, and I'm going to jot down things that affects Earth's weather and climate, the weather and climate. What is weather like right now? Weather describes the atmosphere's conditions in a certain place at a given moment in time. Climate is different. Climate describes average weather patterns over long periods of time. Climate is the average weather of the seasons. It also describes possible weather extremes like tornadoes, hurricanes, droughts, or rainy periods. Weather can change from minute to minute, hour to hour, and day to day. Climate is determined by tracking a region's weather pattern for decades. So, let's keep reading to paragraph 2. How do scientists track their weather patterns? Scientists measure different weather features. They measure the temperature, which is how hot or cold a place is. They measure the amount of precipitation that falls as rain and snow or sleet from the sky. They also measure other factors such as wind, humidity, and cloud coverage. Scientists use different tools to measure these factors. They record their measurements and observations. They use the data to find out the weather patterns of a region. Using this information, they can define the climate type. Okay, so what affects the climate and weather? Scientists study. We've learned that scientists, so I'm writing down scientists study. They study and measure things like temp, rain, wind, using tools. All right, so now we're going to go to paragraph 3 and paragraph 4. Here we go. On page 8, paragraph 3. Some climates are hot and rainy. Others tend to be cold and dry. These different climates are used by different factors. For example, regions closer to the equator receive more direct sunlight. As a result, they tend to be warmer. Places colder to water have more moisture or humidity in the air. As a result, they tend to get more rainfall. Regions far from the equator tend to be cold. Places far from the water tend to be dry. So what affects the weather and climate? What affects the weather and climate is where places are on the globe, on a map. So for right here, what I'm going to write down is where a place is on the map affects weather. Okay, now I'm going to go to paragraph 4. Land features and elevation, height above sea level, are also factors. As a result, Earth has several different climate zones. There are 5 main climate zones: tropical, dry moderate, continental, and polar. Each climate has its own characteristics. Each climate also supports its own diverse forms of plant and animal life. Understanding a region's climate helps people predict the typical weather that can happen throughout the year. Okay, so climate zones also affect the weather and climate. So go ahead and write that down in your notes. Okay, so now looking at our graphic organizer, what affects the climate and weather? So things that affect the weather and climate are, So for this informational text of Earth's weather and climate, what it does is it describes the more scientific aspects of what affects or changes Earth weather and climate. So looking at measuring, having scientists look at things, where a location is on the globe or on the map, and the different zones that it's in. So for this graphic organizer right here, what I would do is write down, it's a more scientific approach on how weather and climate is changed and what affects weather and climate. Go ahead and write that down. Go. All right, so then using this information of how Indian summer began and Earth's weather and climate, we're going to focus on the authors. So how Indian summer began doesn't technically have an author, but somebody wrote it. So we're going to focus on this person that we don't know who wrote it. So what does this tell you about each author? So how Indian summer began is what's it called? It's a porky tale. It is a tale. It's a fictional story. It's more concerned with telling a fantastical story of how weather and climate change, while Earth's weather and climate is more scientific based. So the author for Earth's weather and climate is kind of a scientist and looks at more informational and factual things. All right, so both of these texts are very different, right? How Indian Summer Began is a tale. It's more fantastical and it's fictional, while Earth's Weather and Climate is very factual and scientific. So the authors are very different. They're trying to do two very different things. For How Indian Summer Began, it's more of a story. It's more of an entertainment story that has potentially some truth to it, while Earth's Weather and Climate is all about facts. So it's more informative. So that's kind of the difference between the two authors. That'll help you with this question. All right, and the question on the bottom says, How Indian Summer Began and Earth's Weather and Climate are two passages that tell about different factors affecting the climate and weather. Which of the following statements are true? True. Choose all that apply. So read through and check off all of them that apply. What are they different? How do they explain the effects of weather and climate? So go answer that question and don't forget to write this on your log. How I want you to write this on your log is to type out the sentence that you've chosen. I'm going to tell you right now, there are 3 check marks that you need to make. There are 3 correct answers where it says choose all apply. So go ahead and do that, and there you go. All right, and we are done with this lesson for today. This was Thursday's lesson, mini lesson number 14. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I hope it helped. Hope you were able to follow along. Thank you so much. See you later. Bye.